Nonviolence section, between the aspiration to co-option and the struggle for recognition. On closer examination, the dilemma faced by the civil rights movement and African American militants did not primarily concern attitudes towards violence. What, at least for the foreseeable future, rendered any revolutionary hypothesis meaningless in the United States was the small percentage of blacks in the population and the existing balance of forces. In Malcolm X, the most mature representative of African American radicalism, accents that might be characterized as Gandhian could sometimes be heard. He celebrated the bloodless revolution that had put an end to British colonialism's puppet monarchy in Egypt, and paid tribute to the self-control of blacks who, although armed, did not fall into the trap set by police brutality. No, it was not a question of fighting the white man with cudgels. The truth sufficed. End quote. Hence, it was necessary to engage ideologically and politically, also organizing to exercise the right to vote, despite the violence and intimidation of the racist gangs, and to exert influence electorally. Malcolm X's insistence on the right to self-defense, proper to any free man, did not in fact entail a summons to armed rebellion, and still less a superstitious cult of violence. Quote, I am not an advocate of violence, but the violence that exists in the United States is violence whose victim is the Negro. End quote. When the forces of order stood to one side, it was necessary somehow to defend oneself against, quote, the violent acts carried out by organized groups like the Ku Klux Klan. End quote. And let us not forget that the right to self-defense was recognized, at least on a strictly private level, by King as well. Malcolm X's political line was marked by the attempt and stated intention to remove the black question, quote, from the national or domestic context, from the jurisdiction of the U.S. government, in order to internationalize it. Rather than appealing to the goodwill of America's rulers, they should be denounced in every international venue and, above all, before the countries and peoples of the Third World. King's orientation was different. He concluded his most famous speech, delivered on the 28th of August 1963, as follows. Quote, in spite of the difficulties and frustrations of the moment, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. End quote. Although extraordinarily effective rhetorically, this declaration is highly debatable historically and philologically. The country that emerged from the Declaration of Independence cited here had for decades had presidents who were nearly always slave owners, and had developed racial chattel slavery and the dehumanization and reification of slaves to the utmost. At the end of the Civil War, it had, much later than many other countries and territories in the Western Hemisphere, abolished the institution of slavery, but only to impose a regime of terroristic white supremacy, which had no points of comparison in Latin America, and which continued in a way to survive 2 centuries on from the Declaration of Independence. Did this solemn document theorize the equality of human beings regardless of color? Or did it refer exclusively to the white community? In fact, it was written by a slave owner, Thomas Jefferson, who was convinced of the intellectual inferiority of blacks, and never sought to free his own slaves. Scarcely credible at the level of historical reconstruction, King's speech betrays a clear political orientation. It was an appeal to the liberal sectors of the U.S. ruling class, not a priori to exclude the black community from the, quote, American dream, imparting greater credibility to the latter internationally as well. This was the sense in which, again in 1963, King criticized his left-wing critics for having, quote, lost faith in America. In effect, not all African Americans recognized themselves in the American dream and faith in America. On the contrary, the ex-slaves often engaged in constructing a very different identity from that of the ex-slave owners, rediscovered their roots, which took them back ideally to Africa, and, turning their attention to the struggles underway globally against colonial or semi-colonial domination, felt themselves to be an integral part of this gigantic liberation movement. They were thus led to solidarize with peoples and political movements that often had to confront U.S. hostility. The dispute between these two tendencies had been ongoing for decades among African Americans. But it became significantly more acute with the outbreak of the Cold War, when, to solidarize with the anti-colonial movement and Third World struggles, exposed people to the accusation of complicity with the communist movement and betrayal of their country. The more moderate currents, more inclined to appeal to the benevolence of the dominant class, and sharing the, quote, American dream with it, were not in fact more consistently nonviolent. The introduction of conscription in 1948 was the occasion for A. Philip Randolph, a prestigious black leader who is now a fervent anti-communist, to underscore the advantages to be derived from desegregation of the military as follows. The credibility of American democracy would be strengthened among blacks, and they would furnish stauncher support to the rulers in Washington during the Cold War, and if it came to it, hot war. The true line of demarcation begins to emerge. The inception of the civil rights movement in the United States coincided with a powerful development of the struggle of blacks in South Africa, who pursued the same ends, desegregation, and often employed the same means as those adopted by African Americans. However, little attention was paid to this struggle by King and his collaborators, who were careful not to denounce the diplomatic support extended by the U.S. government to the architects of the apartheid regime. The fear of being stigmatized and persecuted as communists was strong, and there was a clear realization that Washington was disposed to look with indulgence or benevolence on a movement for co-option, but certainly not on a struggle that linked the emancipation of a people of colonial origin in the United States, African Americans, with general recognition and emancipation of peoples in colonial or semi-colonial conditions in the rest of the world. It was King himself who later drew attention to what happened as soon as he began to criticize the war in Vietnam, which witnessed a maximum deployment of violence in particularly brutal forms. Quote, I was chided, even by fellow civil rights leaders, members of Congress, and Brothers of the Cloth for not sticking to the business of civil rights for American blacks. End quote. Those who aspired to co-option considered it misleading and counterproductive also to apply the rule of nonviolence to international relations and Washington's foreign policy. Very different was the attitude of the more mature King, who expressed regret for the tardiness of his condemnation of the war in Vietnam. Quote, as I moved to break the betrayal of my own silences and to speak from the burnings of my own heart, as I called for radical departures from the destruction of Vietnam, many persons questioned me about the wisdom of my path. End quote. The sponsors of co-option were obviously supported by the dominant powers and ideologies. Quote, when I first took my position against the war in Vietnam, almost every newspaper in the country criticized me. End quote, and end of section.